8 family members, 4 crime scenes, one night of terror that shattered a small Ohio community forever. What happened on April 22, 2016, in Pike County wasn't just murder. It was systematic execution carried out with military precision by people the victims trusted most. As a criminologist who has spent over 2 decades analyzing the darkest corners of human behavior, I can tell you this case breaks every rule we know about family annihilators and mass murder events. The perpetrators lived among their victims for years, planning, waiting, and when they finally struck, they didn't just kill. They obliterated an entire bloodline while 3 young children slept mere feet away, deliberately spared in what can only be described as calculated psychological warfare. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I've profiled over 300 homicide cases throughout my career. Serial killers, spree shooters, domestic terrorists. I thought I'd seen the depths of human evil. But the Pike County Massacre presented behavioral patterns so unique, so methodically planned, that it forced me to completely reimagine what we think we know about family violence and revenge killing. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime story. It's a psychological dissection of one of the most coldly calculated mass murders in American history, where the killers didn't just want their victims dead, they wanted them erased. The morning of April 22, 2016, started like any other in Pike County, Ohio. This rural community of just over 28,000 people was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where generations of families had lived and worked the same land, where trust wasn't just given, it was inherited. That trust would prove fatal for the Rhoden family. At 11:12 a.m., a 911 call shattered the rural quiet. Bobby Jo Manley had driven to Union Hill Road to check on her brother-in-law, Christopher Rhoden Sr., and what she found defied comprehension. The front door was locked, but she could see through a window. Christopher, a 40-year-old father of 3, lay motionless in his bed, a pool of blood beneath his head. But this was just the beginning. Within hours, law enforcement would discover a scene of carnage spread across 4 different locations, all within a few miles of each other in the rolling hills of Pike County. 8 members of the Rhoden family had been systematically executed, shot multiple times in the head at close range while they slept. The precision was surgical. The planning was meticulous. The brutality was absolute. But here's what makes this case criminologically fascinating and deeply disturbing. 3 young children were found unharmed at the crime scenes, sleeping peacefully just rooms away from the bloodbath. This wasn't random violence or a crime of passion. This was selective elimination carried out by individuals who knew exactly who needed to die and who needed to live. Christopher Rhoden Sr.'s mobile home on Union Hill Road was crime scene number 1. He'd been shot multiple times in the head. In the same trailer, investigators found his cousin, Gary Rhoden, 38, also executed in his sleep. The killers had moved through that home with the quiet efficiency of trained assassins, taking 2 lives without disturbing the children sleeping nearby. A quarter-mile down the road sat the second crime scene, another mobile home where Christopher's ex-wife, Dana Manley Rhoden, 37, lived with their children. Dana had been shot 4 times in the head. Her teenage son, Christopher Jr., 16, was found in his bedroom, also shot multiple times. But Dana's other children were unharmed, asleep in their beds as if nothing had happened. The third location, a camper on the same property, revealed perhaps the most chilling aspect of this methodical killing spree. Inside, investigators found Clarence Frankie Rhoden, 20, Christopher Sr.'s son, and his fiancée Hannah Hazel Gilly, 20. Both had been shot execution-style in the head. Their 6-month-old son was found between them in the bed, covered in his parents' blood but completely unharmed. The fourth and final crime scene was 3 miles away on Left Fork Road. Here, Kenneth Rhoden, 44, Christopher Sr.'s brother, and his cousin Hannah Mae Rhoden, 19, had both been shot multiple times. Hannah's 4-day-old daughter was found in bed with her mother's body, also unharmed. 8 people dead. 3 children deliberately spared. 4 crime scenes showing identical methods of execution. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of struggle. These weren't random killings. They were targeted assassinations carried out by people the victims knew and trusted enough to let into their homes in the middle of the night. As a criminologist, I've learned that mass murder events typically fall into specific categories. We have family annihilators who kill their own family members before taking their own lives, usually driven by financial ruin or relationship breakdown. We have spree killers who move from location to location in a compressed time frame, often fueled by psychosis or rage. We have mass shooters who target strangers in public places, seeking notoriety or expressing grievances against society. The Pike County Massacre fits none of these established patterns. The killers planned this operation for months, possibly years. They knew the layout of each home, the sleeping patterns of each victim, and most crucially, which family members needed to die and which needed to survive. This level of premeditation combined with selective targeting suggests something far more complex than typical family violence. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most expensive in Ohio's history. The state attorney general's office took over the case, deploying over 100 investigators and spending millions of dollars over the next 2 years trying to unravel what happened that night. Initial theories focused on the family's involvement in marijuana cultivation. Christopher Rhoden Sr. and some family members had been growing cannabis, and investigators initially suspected drug-related violence. Perhaps a cartel had decided to send a message. Perhaps a deal had gone wrong. But as the investigation deepened, this theory began to fall apart. Drug dealers don't typically spare children during executions. Cartels don't methodically plan multi-location hits over family custody disputes. And most importantly, the evidence began pointing toward a much more personal motive, one that had been building for years right under everyone's noses. The breakthrough came through digital forensics and behavioral analysis. Investigators began piecing together a complex web of family relationships, romantic entanglements, and simmering resentments that had been festering in Pike County's tight-knit community for years. At the center of it all was a custody dispute involving Hannah Hazel Gilley's daughter, Sophia. But this wasn't just any custody dispute. It was a battle that had consumed 2 families and ultimately led to the annihilation of one of them. Before we dive deeper into the psychological profile of the perpetrators and the shocking arrest that would come 2 years later, I need you to understand something crucial about this case. If you're fascinated by the intersection of psychology and criminal behavior, if you want to understand how seemingly normal people can plan and execute mass murder with the precision of military operations, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal about the behavioral patterns and planning that went into this massacre will fundamentally change how you think about family violence and long-term criminal planning. The psychological analysis gets much deeper from here, and you won't want to miss a single detail. The answer to who committed the Pike County Massacre would ultimately lie not in drug deals or random violence, but in the most primal of human emotions: jealousy, control, and the desperate need to possess what cannot be possessed. But the perpetrators weren't strangers or business rivals. They were family. In November 2018, more than 2.5 years after the murders, Ohio authorities made arrests that shocked even seasoned investigators. The Wagner family, George Billy Wagner III, his wife Angela, and their sons Edward Jake Wagner and George Wagner IV were charged with aggravated murder in the deaths of the 8 Rhoden family members. This wasn't just a case of neighbors killing neighbors. Jake Wagner had previously been in a relationship with Hannah Hazel Gilley, and they shared a daughter together. The custody arrangements for their child had become a source of escalating conflict between the 2 families, but nobody could have predicted it would lead to mass murder. As a criminologist, I've studied family annihilators for decades, and the Wagner case presents characteristics I've never encountered before. Traditional family annihilators kill their own family members, usually in a moment of crisis or desperation. The Wagners planned and executed the systematic elimination of another family entirely, while carefully preserving their own family unit and the next generation of children. The behavioral analysis of this case reveals a level of psychological sophistication that challenges everything we think we know about domestic mass murder. The Wagners didn't just decide one day to kill the Rhodens. Evidence would later show they had been planning this operation for months, possibly years, with the methodical patience of professional killers. Consider the logistics alone. 4 different crime scenes, 8 targeted victims, 3 children to be deliberately spared, multiple weapons to be acquired and disposed of, alibis to be established, and evidence to be eliminated. This required coordination, planning, and psychological compartmentalization that goes far beyond typical domestic violence. The planning phase appears to have begun in early 2016, shortly after Jake Wagner and Hannah Gillies' relationship deteriorated and custody disputes over their daughter intensified. Phone records and digital evidence would later reveal the Wagner family began researching the Rhoden family's daily routines, work schedules, and sleeping arrangements. They purchased trucks, weapons, and surveillance equipment. They studied the rural road systems around the crime scenes to plan entry and exit routes. They established alibis and created a timeline that would give them several hours to complete their mission and return home without being detected. Most chillingly, they made the calculated decision about which family members had to die and which could live. The 3 young children found unharmed weren't spared by accident or mercy. They were deliberately preserved as part of the plan. This suggests the Wagners saw themselves not as murderers, but as surgical eliminators removing specific threats to their family structure while protecting the next generation. The psychological profile that emerges from this case is deeply disturbing. The Wagner family functioned as a cohesive criminal unit, with each member playing a specific role in the planning and execution of mass murder. This level of family coordination in homicide is extraordinarily rare and suggests a shared psychological framework that normalized extreme violence as a solution to interpersonal conflict. George Wagner III, the family patriarch, appears to have been the strategic planner. His wife Angela handled logistical support and evidence disposal. Their son Jake was the primary executor, motivated by his obsession with controlling his ex-girlfriend and their shared child. Edward, the younger son, served as backup and lookout. What makes this case criminologically unique is how the family maintained normal social functioning while planning mass murder. They attended community events, maintained jobs, and interacted with neighbors and law enforcement without arousing suspicion. This requires a level of psychological compartmentalization typically associated with organized crime or military operations, not family disputes. The timeline of the murders reveals tactical precision that speaks to extensive planning and rehearsal. The killers moved between the 4 crime scenes with efficiency that suggests they had practiced these routes multiple times. They knew exactly where each victim would be sleeping, which doors would be unlocked, and how to navigate each home in complete darkness without waking the children. The ballistics evidence showed the same weapons were used across multiple crime scenes, but the firearms were never recovered. This suggests sophisticated evidence disposal planning that went far beyond simply hiding murder weapons. The Wagner family had clearly thought through every aspect of the investigation that would follow. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of this case is the selective nature of the killings. The decision to spare the children while eliminating the adults required the killers to maintain emotional control and execute precise judgment in the midst of committing mass murder. This isn't the behavior of people acting in passion or rage. This is the behavior of individuals who had mentally rehearsed these killings until they could perform them with the detachment of a surgical procedure. The community impact of the Pike County Massacre extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Rural communities like Pike County operate on trust and extended family networks that span generations. When that trust is violated by systematic betrayal and murder from within, it creates psychological trauma that affects entire communities for decades. Local residents reported feeling unsafe in their own homes for the first time in their lives. Property values dropped. Families moved away. The social fabric that had held this rural community together for generations was permanently damaged by the realization that neighbors could plan and execute mass murder while maintaining facades of normalcy and friendship. The investigation itself became a study in modern forensic techniques applied to complex domestic terrorism. Digital forensics played a crucial role in reconstructing the Wagner family's planning activities through phone records, internet searches, and social media communications. Financial records revealed suspicious purchases of equipment and vehicles in the months leading up to the murders. But the breakthrough in the case came through behavioral analysis and psychological pressure applied during interrogations. Jake Wagner, the primary perpetrator, eventually broke under questioning and provided a full confession that implicated his entire family in the planning and execution of the murders. His confession revealed the depth of obsession and control that motivated the killings. Jake Wagner couldn't accept that Hannah Gilly had moved on from their relationship and was building a life with someone else. Rather than accepting the reality of shared custody arrangements, he became fixated on the idea that eliminating Hannah and her family was the only way to gain complete control over their daughter. The family reinforced these delusions rather than seeking help or intervention. They transformed a custody dispute into a military-style operation designed to eliminate perceived threats to their family structure. This collective enabling of extreme violence represents a form of shared psychosis that criminologists are still working to understand. The trial proceedings revealed additional disturbing details about the Wagner family's mindset and planning. They had researched legal procedures around child custody in cases where parents are deceased. They had discussed how to comfort and care for Jake's daughter after her mother's murder. They had planned not just the killings, but the psychological manipulation of the surviving child who would be traumatized by their actions. This level of calculated cruelty extends beyond simple murder into psychological terrorism designed to control and possess another human being completely. The Wagner family didn't just want Hannah Gilley dead. They wanted to erase her family's influence on their granddaughter while positioning themselves as her sole protectors and caregivers. From a criminological perspective, the Pike County Massacre represents a new category of domestic mass violence that challenges our existing frameworks for understanding family-related homicide. The combination of long-term planning, multi-generational family involvement, selective targeting, and psychological manipulation creates a behavioral pattern that requires new approaches to prediction and prevention. Traditional domestic violence intervention strategies focus on protecting individual victims from specific abusers. But how do you identify and intervene in cases where entire families are planning systematic elimination of other families over custody disputes? The behavioral warning signs that typically indicate escalating domestic violence, isolation, control, threats were present, but directed toward a different family entirely. The Wagner family's ability to maintain normal community relationships while planning mass murder also highlights the limitations of community-based prevention strategies. Neighbors, friends, and even law enforcement had no indication that this family was capable of such extreme violence. They appeared to be dealing with typical custody and relationship issues that thousands of families navigate without resorting to violence. But if you examine the case more closely, there were subtle behavioral indicators that suggest this family had normalized violence as a problem-solving mechanism long before the Pike County Massacre. Previous conflicts and disputes in their lives show patterns of escalation, intimidation, and unwillingness to accept outcomes they couldn't control. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of this case for understanding criminal behavior: the role of family systems in enabling and executing extreme violence. The Wagner family didn't have one dangerous individual who convinced others to participate in murder. They had a family culture that collectively normalized and planned mass murder as an acceptable solution to interpersonal conflict. George Wagner III and his wife Angela weren't passive participants or reluctant accomplices. They were active planners who saw the elimination of the Rhoden family as necessary to protect their family structure and ensure their continued access to their granddaughter. This represents a form of collective criminal thinking that goes beyond individual psychopathy into shared delusion and group violence. The psychological aftermath for the surviving children adds another layer of complexity to this case. Jake Wagner's daughter, who is the catalyst for the custody dispute that led to 8 murders, will grow up knowing that her father and his family killed her mother and extended family to gain control over her. The psychological trauma of this knowledge will affect her for the rest of her life. The other children who survived the massacre, found sleeping peacefully while their parents were executed in nearby rooms, faced similar lifelong psychological challenges. They were deliberately spared by the killers, but they must live with the knowledge that people they trusted planned and carried out the systematic elimination of their families. If you're still watching this analysis, it means you understand that true crime isn't just about entertainment. It's about understanding the darkest aspects of human psychology and behavior. The Pike County Massacre offers insights into family violence, long-term criminal planning, and collective criminal behavior that are relevant to law enforcement, mental health professionals, and anyone trying to understand how seemingly normal people can commit extraordinarily evil acts. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because we regularly analyze cases that reveal new patterns in criminal behavior and psychological analysis. Hit that like button if this deep dive into criminal psychology is providing insights you can't find anywhere else. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests revealed additional disturbing details about the planning and execution of the Pike County Massacre. The prosecution's case painted a picture of a family that had spent months preparing for mass murder with the systematic approach of a military operation. Evidence presented at trial showed the Wagner family had purchased multiple vehicles, weapons, and surveillance equipment in the months leading up to the murders. They had established alibis, researched the victims' daily routines, and created detailed plans for carrying out the killings and disposing of evidence. Jake Wagner's confession, which became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, revealed the psychological motivations that drove the family to such extreme measures. His obsession with controlling Hannah Gilley and their daughter had consumed not just him, but his entire family, who saw the elimination of the Rhoden family as the only way to protect their family structure. The confession also revealed the cold calculation that went into deciding who would live and who would die. The 3 young children found unharmed at the crime scenes weren't spared by mercy or accident. They were deliberately preserved because they posed no threat to the Wagner family's plans and could potentially serve as witnesses to the Rhoden's supposedly dangerous lifestyle. This selective killing pattern is extremely rare in mass murder cases and suggests a level of psychological control and planning that challenges our understanding of domestic violence escalation. Most family annihilators kill in moments of crisis or desperation, taking their own lives shortly after killing family members. The Wagners planned to survive their crimes and continue living normal lives while raising Jake's daughter as if nothing had happened. The behavioral evidence presented at trial also revealed how the Wagner family maintained psychological distance from their victims even while living in the same small community. They had dehumanized the Rhoden family members, viewing them not as individuals with their own rights and relationships, but as obstacles to be eliminated in service of their family's goals. This process of dehumanization is typically associated with warfare, genocide, or organized crime, not custody disputes between neighbors. The Wagner family's ability to transform a personal conflict into a military-style elimination operation speaks to psychological processes that criminologists are still working to understand. The trial proceedings also revealed the sophisticated evidence disposal and counter-surveillance techniques the Wagner family had planned and implemented. They had researched law enforcement investigation procedures, anticipated forensic analysis of the crime scenes, and taken extensive measures to avoid detection and prosecution. This level of criminal sophistication is rarely seen in domestic violence cases, which typically involve impulsive acts of violence followed by poor attempts to conceal evidence. The Wagner family's approach was more consistent with organized crime or terrorism, suggesting they had fundamentally reframed their domestic dispute as a war that justified any level of violence or deception. The community impact testimony presented during the trial revealed the lasting psychological damage the Pike County Massacre inflicted on rural Pike County. Residents described feeling unsafe in their homes for the first time in their lives, unable to trust neighbors or community members who had seemed perfectly normal before the arrests. The realization that 4 members of a local family had spent months planning the systematic execution of 8 neighbors while maintaining facades of normalcy and community involvement created a crisis of trust that affected every aspect of community life. Churches, schools, local businesses, and social organizations all struggled with the knowledge that mass murderers had been living and working among them undetected. This community trauma represents a form of collective victimization that extends far beyond the immediate families affected by the murders. When trust and safety are violated at this level in small communities, the psychological effects can persist for generations. The sentencing phase of the trials revealed additional insights into the Wagner family's psychological functioning and their complete lack of remorse or understanding of the magnitude of their crimes. Even when faced with life sentences and the destruction of their own family, they showed no genuine comprehension of the pain and trauma they had inflicted on others. Jake Wagner, who received life in prison without parole in exchange for his confession and testimony against his family members, showed some acknowledgement of guilt but continued to frame his actions in terms of protecting his daughter rather than accepting responsibility for mass murder. This psychological framework suggests he still views himself as a protective father rather than a mass murderer. His parents and brother maintained their innocence throughout the proceedings, despite overwhelming evidence of their participation in planning and executing the murders. This denial represents a form of psychological defense that allows them to maintain their self-image as good family members while refusing to confront the reality of their actions. The Wagner family's continued denial and lack of remorse highlights one of the most disturbing aspects of this case: their ability to compartmentalize extreme violence while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness. They genuinely believed they were justified in eliminating the Rhoden family to protect their own family structure. This psychological framework helps explain how they were able to plan and execute mass murder without showing obvious behavioral warning signs that might have alerted community members or law enforcement. They weren't struggling with guilt or moral conflict because they had convinced themselves their actions were necessary and justified. From a criminological research perspective, the Pike County Massacre offers unique insights into several areas of criminal behavior that are not well understood. The case provides data on long-term criminal planning in domestic violence contexts, family-based criminal organizations, selective mass violence, and the psychological processes that enable seemingly normal people to commit extraordinarily evil acts. The planning timeline revealed through digital forensics and confession testimony shows that complex mass murder operations can be conceived, planned, and executed by individuals with no military or criminal background. The Wagner family developed tactical planning skills, counter-surveillance techniques, and evidence disposal strategies that rivaled those used by professional criminals. This has important implications for law enforcement training and prevention strategies. Traditional approaches to domestic violence intervention focus on identifying escalating conflict between specific individuals in intimate relationships, but the Pike County case shows that family-based threats can extend beyond immediate relationship partners to include extended family networks planning violence against other families. The case also reveals gaps in our understanding of how family systems can collectively normalize and enable extreme violence. Individual psychological assessments and interventions may be insufficient when dealing with entire families that have developed shared delusions and criminal objectives. The selective nature of the Pike County killings also provides insights into how perpetrators of mass violence make decisions about who lives and who dies. The Wagner family's decision to spare the young children while eliminating the adults suggests they were operating under a complex set of moral and practical calculations that went far beyond simple revenge or elimination of threats. Understanding these decision-making processes could help law enforcement and mental health professionals identify families or groups that may be planning selective violence and develop intervention strategies that address the specific psychological frameworks that enable such crimes. The digital evidence recovered in the Pike County case also demonstrates the importance of comprehensive forensic analysis in complex domestic violence cases. The Wagner family's extensive use of technology for planning, communication, and research left digital traces that ultimately led to their conviction. But recovering and analyzing this evidence required sophisticated techniques and significant resources. This highlights the need for law enforcement agencies to have access to advanced digital forensics capabilities when investigating complex domestic violence cases that may involve long-term planning and multiple perpetrators. As we near the end of this analysis, I want you to consider something that keeps me awake at night as a criminologist. How many other families are out there right now, planning systematic violence against neighbors, relatives, or community members while maintaining perfect facades of normalcy? The Wagner family lived, worked, and socialized in Pike County for years while planning mass murder, and nobody suspected a thing. What does this tell us about our ability to identify and prevent family-based domestic terrorism before it escalates to mass violence? These are the questions that drive my research and analysis of cases like this. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think there were warning signs the community missed? Or is this type of long-term, family-based criminal planning essentially impossible to detect and prevent? Have you ever lived in a small community where you later discovered neighbors were capable of violence you never would have imagined? Your insights and experiences help inform our understanding of these complex criminal behaviors, so please share your thoughts and make sure to subscribe for more deep-dive psychological analysis of cases that challenge everything we think we know about criminal behavior. The aftermath of the Pike County Massacre continues to reverberate through the criminal justice system, academic research, and law enforcement training programs across the country. The case has become a study in how traditional approaches to domestic violence prevention and intervention may be insufficient when dealing with family-based criminal organizations planning systematic violence. Law enforcement agencies have begun incorporating lessons learned from the Pike County investigation into their training programs for domestic violence and family conflict situations. The case demonstrates that custody disputes and relationship conflicts can escalate beyond individual violence to involve extended family networks planning and executing mass murder operations. The digital forensics techniques developed during the Pike County investigation have also influenced how law enforcement agencies approach complex domestic violence cases. The extensive digital evidence trail left by the Wagner family's planning activities required new approaches to data recovery, analysis, and presentation in court proceedings. Mental health professionals have also studied the Pike County case for insights into family systems that enable and normalize extreme violence. The Wagner family's ability to collectively plan and execute mass murder while maintaining normal community relationships challenges traditional understanding of how criminal behavior develops and manifests within family structures. The case has also influenced academic research into the psychological processes that enable ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. The Wagner family's transformation from typical rural residents dealing with custody issues to coordinated mass murderers provides unique data on how criminal thinking develops within family systems. Victim advocacy organizations have used the Pike County case to highlight the need for more sophisticated approaches to protecting potential victims of family-based violence. Traditional domestic violence protection strategies focus on individual relationships, but the Pike County case shows that threats can extend to entire family networks planning systematic elimination of perceived enemies. The surviving children from the Pike County Massacre face lifelong challenges that extend far beyond typical trauma counseling and support services. They must process not only the loss of their family members, but the knowledge that trusted community members planned and executed their deaths while deliberately sparing them as part of a calculated psychological manipulation strategy. Child welfare services and trauma counselors have had to develop new approaches to supporting children who survive family-based mass violence events. The psychological complexity of understanding why they were spared while their parents were murdered requires specialized therapeutic techniques that address both survivor guilt and the reality of ongoing threat from the perpetrator's family networks. The Pike County Massacre also raises important questions about community responsibility and the limits of neighbor-based safety networks in rural areas. The Wagner family's ability to plan mass murder while maintaining normal community relationships suggests that traditional informal community monitoring systems may be insufficient to identify and prevent sophisticated criminal planning. Rural communities often rely on extended family networks and informal social connections to identify potential threats and provide mutual protection. But when those same networks are used to plan and execute violence, communities may need to develop new approaches to identifying and responding to potential threats from within their own social structures. The legal precedents established by the Pike County prosecutions have also influenced how district attorneys approach complex domestic violence cases involving multiple perpetrators and crime scenes. The case demonstrated that family-based criminal organizations can be successfully prosecuted using techniques typically reserved for organized crime or terrorism cases. The plea negotiations and cooperation agreements used to secure Jake Wagner's confession and testimony against his family members have become models for how prosecutors can break apart family-based criminal organizations by creating incentives for individual members to cooperate with law enforcement. As I conclude this analysis of the Pike County Massacre, I want to emphasize that this case represents more than just another true crime story. It provides crucial insights into how family systems can collectively normalize and enable extreme violence, how long-term criminal planning can be concealed within normal community relationships, and how custody disputes can escalate into systematic mass murder. The behavioral patterns revealed by the Wagner family's planning and execution of these murders challenge our existing frameworks for understanding domestic violence, family conflict, and community safety. This case forces us to expand our definitions of domestic terrorism to include family-based organizations planning systematic violence against other families. The Pike County Massacre also demonstrates the importance of sophisticated investigative techniques and resources when dealing with complex domestic violence cases. The digital forensics, behavioral analysis, and coordinated prosecution strategies that led to the Wagner family's convictions required expertise and resources that may not be available to smaller law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. Perhaps most importantly, this case reminds us that the capacity for extreme violence can exist within seemingly normal families and communities, hidden behind facades of respectability and social cooperation. The Wagner family's ability to plan and execute mass murder, while maintaining normal community relationships, should serve as a warning that our assumptions about who is capable of extreme violence may be dangerously incomplete. The 8 members of the Rhoden family who died on April 22, 2016, were not just victims of domestic violence or family conflict. They were casualties of a form of family-based domestic terrorism that challenges our understanding of criminal behavior and community safety. Their deaths revealed the existence of criminal planning and coordination capabilities within ordinary American families that law enforcement and mental health professionals are still working to understand and address. The Pike County Massacre will continue to influence criminal justice practice, academic research, and community safety strategies for years to come. The case provides unique insights into the psychology of family-based violence, the logistics of coordinated mass murder, and the long-term community impacts of domestic terrorism carried out by trusted neighbors and community members. As we work to prevent similar tragedies in the future, we must acknowledge that traditional approaches to domestic violence prevention may be insufficient when dealing with family-based criminal organizations capable of long-term planning and systematic violence. The Pike County case demands that we develop new frameworks for understanding, identifying, and responding to threats that emerge from within the family and community structures we typically view as sources of safety and support. The legacy of the Pike County Massacre lies not just in the 8 lives lost or the families destroyed, but in the lessons learned about the hidden capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary American communities. These lessons must inform our efforts to protect vulnerable individuals and families from those who would use violence to control, possess, and ultimately destroy the lives of others.